Can I ask you, Alexandrina, from a sort of perspective of a Russian abroad, how did it strike you?
Well, I was thinking a lot about how these people who are still warm, had their families, their children, their grandchildren, and for them, they were not that bad people, or they would never would look at them in this sense. And I was thinking that in the contemporary Russia, when we are speaking about corrupted regime and people who serve corrupted regime, who are part of that, but they also are thinking about themselves, that they are just playing the rules, that inside they probably think about trying to justify what's happening, and they see that everything around is the same, and they're just playing by those rules. So they probably are not the same as these people stories of whose we were hearing now. In contemporary Russia, they also don't think that the question is that this is the country which, in Putin's and his surrounding vision, requires this kind of way of. Okay.
What do you mean? It requires.
That recently many people think that we are getting close to the situation which is similar to Stalin's
the return
times.
of the Soviet Union.
In different senses, that like Putin is often compared with Stalin. At the same time, lots of art centers, streets are named by Stalin, or the name of Stalin is returned to that. And there is a big debate if it's the right thing to do. And in a way, Putin gives a kind of unarticulated blessing and allows this to happen. Kind of.
John Freeman, as an American living in Russia, did you find it felt relevant, that it felt fresh?
The play?
Stories, yeah.
Oh, it's an extraordinary piece, actually. I listened to this. The first time I encountered it was a couple of years ago. It was at Oxford. I saw the reading there. I never saw the performance in Moscow, as it turned out. It just didn't. For some reason, I didn't see it. So this is the second time I've encountered it, and I found myself despairing as I listened to this piece. I found myself experiencing genuine despair because clearly this is one of the things I love about this piece is that it points no fingers whatsoever. It has no answers. It does not say somebody is guilty, somebody is innocent. It doesn't mess with that at all. It messes with what it messes with is with life, and with the reality of a life that people lived for decades. Any one of us can dig back into our own pasts and find difficult moments that we rationalize. It so happens that the people that lived in the Soviet Union had perhaps a more difficult life to rationalize than other. And so this piece is, again, I'm going to use the word, a piece that it's not a despairing piece, but it is a piece that causes me to experience despair because I see the same thing happening right now. Because other people around me are doing the very same thing. They're finding the exact same excuses. They're finding the exact same answers to similar questions. When I say people around me, I should perhaps say very briefly that I work in the theater. I indeed was a theater critic for 25 years at the Moscow Times. I'm a translator. I now work for a theater called the Stanislavski Electro Theater in Moscow. And around me, I see people knuckling under, buckling under. I see people making excuses. I see people making the choice that will help them keep their career going. But you know, yeah, I'll support this. I'll support that. I'll keep quiet about this. It's a very, very difficult situation to be in. And so as I listen to this piece about history, about almost ancient history, I sense that it is a return. It's kind of a new approach to the life that I'm actually living right now.
Oliver, can I ask you, as a sort of somebody who observes Russia from afar? I mean, you travel, but somebody from an outside perspective, did it feel like commentary on the past or the present?
Well, I don't know. I read an article today which said the difference between Britain and Germany in terms of our attitude to our past is that in Britain we're proud of our past, and in Germany they define themselves against their past. I think a lot of the problem in Russia is that you can't say it that simply, particularly with regard to the Second World War, which is the defining sort of myth of everyone's upbringing, is that people are proud of it, but people are also aware that what went alongside it is very difficult. And actually, one of the places referred to in Tar, which is where the gentleman's grandfather had been in charge of the camp, and in fact where Alexander Daniel's relatives had been as well. I went there when I was researching my second book to try and track down stories about someone who'd been in a camp there. And it is an absolute gulag town. Everything about it would not have existed without the gulag. It is a coal mining town. Everyone who lives there is either had been in the gulag or is descended from someone who was in the gulag. It is the ultimate place that would have a sort of resistance myth against the Soviet Union within it, and it doesn't have it at all. If you go to the town museum, it says, you know, in huge letters that the victory in the Soviet war was built in the Gulag too, which is a lie. You know, the people in the Gulag were starved to death, and they were, you know, essentially their sentences were extended indefinitely for the duration of the war. They weren't fed. These were people who were put in prison after the war just for having been prisoners of war. It was you know, this all-conquering story of the pride in the Second World War is so important that it makes it very, very hard, I think, to tell another story. And so when I hear this, I met an awful lot of people of that generation who found it very difficult to tell stories about the Gulag and about that, because they didn't want to betray this triumph that they take so much pride in. And I think it's very important to sympathise with that as well as to condemn it. This is something people take tremendous pride in, and I think just it's in a way quite simplistic now to look back on it and say, well, they should have stood up to it, they should have condemned it, because people need stories to live their life by, and everyone needs something to make sense of their lives, and I think that you have to have something to take pride in. You can't, otherwise you can't function, and I think that is the difficulty that Russia has, and it's I think came out incredibly well today that these people were very proud of having built the country. They were proud of where they lived and proud of the fact that they were peasant kids who'd achieved so much. And it's very difficult to say, but at the same time I did these terrible things, because you don't want to admit that.
I think that was one of the really strong things about it, was this nuance, and that sort of partly came out through opposing family ties with big historical acts of brutality. One of the things that came out towards the end a lot was this idea, a process of reckoning that hasn't happened in Russia, lustration. It talked about the Nuremberg trials. One of the quotes that I scribbled down was, one of the main reasons why we've ended up where we are is because we never had the Nuremberg trials. There was no lustration. As a politician, do you think that's correct? Do you think that process should have happened in Russia?
Well, it's a difficult topic, and we see now this resurgence of mass sort of support for Stalin. And I don't think the Russian people can be blamed for that, because, you know, the history of Russia is full of repression, and it's very natural that people have this sort of desire for a strong hand, desire for strong government. And Russian people, after all, after Soviet times, and even before that, Russian sort of society was always under the rule of authoritarianism. But I think the key role is the role that government plays. It can take steps to bring people closer to make sense of its history, to be in touch with reality. But Russian government, over the last 15 years, after sort of the brief opening of the 90s, when there was a lot of discussion about Stalin years, But then the government under Putin took it back and inspired the feelings of xenophobia and imperialism, nationalism in people, and it definitely shows in the way people feel about Stalin now.
And yet it's not an unnuanced process again, because they've just opened up a big Gulag museum, I understand, in Moscow. I haven't been there myself. I don't know if you have, John.
I have not yet, no.
But my understanding from people who have been there is that it doesn't shy away from what the gulags were. So, do you feel like people talk? And John, I think you're the only person on this panel who actually is resident in Russia. So I'm going to come back to you as our sort of our expert on these matters. People talk about a resurgence of the cult of Stalin in Russia. Do you think that's overblown?
No, I don't think that's overblown. And I also want to quickly say just one thing about the Gulag Museum. This Gulag Museum may indeed pose some difficult questions and may bring out some themes that aren't usually brought out, but let's keep in mind that I guarantee you, these people have a hell of a fight keeping that opening the museum, and they'll have a hell of a fight keeping it open. So let's not assume that because a museum like this opens in Moscow, that means that there is room for that kind of talk in Moscow. There probably isn't room, and there will be people pushing hard on them soon. I have no doubts about that. Not having been to the museum yet, I have no doubts about that. Yes, I feel a very strong resurgence in specifically the cult of Stalin, because I don't hear conversations about Stalinism. I don't hear, deep, long intellectual conversations, political. What I see are people using the name of Stalin, using the picture of Stalin, and just using it as a sign, saying, this is good, this is strong. This is part of the Russia that I want to be a part of. You have 3 or 4 in the last 2 years, 3 or 4, maybe even 5 statues and busts around Russia having been erected. Just recently, a Stalin museum was opened up in Perm. Perm is the city where Vsevolod Meyerhold, the great Russian director, was born and grew up. And Stalin killed Meyerhold. The fact that you have a museum, a Stalin museum in the city where Vsevolod Meyerhold was born, is absolutely insane. It's asinine. And I don't think there's anybody actually asking hard questions. I really don't believe that. Stalin is a figure. He's a sign that is being used. This is our greatness. This is power. And people are running to that for whatever reasons. I'm not going to pass judgment on people right now, but as a fact, that's, yeah.
I would also add, like the way how history is taught in schools, how Stalin is presented in their school history books. It's another illustration. Museum is one thing. It doesn't influence mass culture and mass perception of the Stalin's role as much as books, films, and like mass propaganda, which has much more influence on them.
Talking of books and films, and there was a lot of talk of censorship in this play. Where are we at in Russia on that front? This play, Noah, correct me if I'm wrong, but this play's been on in Russia, right?
Yes.
There's no problem with that. That you take it round, it tours.
But it's very small theater. It was like in theater for maybe 100 or 200 people, right?
The theatre that ran it sort of effectively has closed down 2 years after it opened.
As a result of putting that on, or as a result of their
It's hard to say
general
directly,
editorial?
but it's sort of linked in, let's say.
That's Noah Berkson-Bream. He translated the play and is director of Sputnik Theatre. What's your feeling, Vladimir, where we're at in the sort of intersection of arts and politics in Russia and censorship, maybe even self-censorship? What's the state of the art?
Well, we know that all TV channels are controlled by state, and there is a very heavy censorship, and actually it's used as a tool for propaganda. Especially it has been very blatant in this Ukrainian campaign over the last year and a half. And we see that this censorship is creeping into the arts world. We There's a famous example of a play Tangazer, which was shut down in Novosibirsk, and I think in the last few days there was talk. The Minister of Culture was saying that from now on, all new plays, all modern plays, have to be vetted by some special committee within the ministry before being put on stage.
Another famous story which was widely discussed, Marat Gelman's gallery, who was ordered to leave one of the probably first contemporary galleries in Russia, which was opened maybe around 20 years ago. So recently he was ordered to leave Vinzavod because he had some kind of art auction trying to raise funds for political prisoners. And this was a big discussion and scandal about that, as a director of Vinzavod wrote a letter asking him to leave within few days.
You have quite an interesting story, Alexandrina Mark, together with Vladimir, because Vladimir's a politician and you were involved in the arts, and you eventually you have an open court case against you in Russia connected to your work in the arts, which you believe is motivated because of Vladimir's political activities. Can you just give us a very brief description of what happened?
Well, I personally was never involved in politics anyhow. My only connection is Vladimir Ashurkov, my partner. My entire life I was involved in different arts projects. I was running a company which was organizing exhibitions, festivals. Like, to give just a few ideas, I was organizing an exhibition of Norman Foster in Pushkin Museum, Vivienne Westwood show in Kazansky railway station, lots of different books, festivals and other events. For like more than 15 years maybe I was doing that. Since I met Vladimir and we became partners, quite quickly our life changed. We had our apartment was raided. It was in 2014.
Once in 2013 and then once in 2014, just before we left Russia.
Well, and when we left Russia, Ты расскажешь всё это мне.
Well, basically, our story is quite simple. There was a sense of escalation of repressions in the beginning of 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, and Navalny was put under house arrest. Our apartment was raided and by the police, and the video footage from that raid was shown on the same evening on national TV in a defamatory video. So, well, conveniently, we planned to be in London in May of that year because our son was due to be born in London. And a week after he was born, a criminal case was opened against me and two of my associates. It was a politically motivated case. And soon thereafter, I filed for political asylum, which I got last year. And bizarrely, in December of 2014, a separate criminal case was opened against Sasha. Basically, the allegation was that she stole some of the government money that her company received for organizing the book fairs for Moscow government. So between ourselves, we joke that we probably are the only family where there is a separate politically motivated criminal cases against each of us.
Well done, you. Oliver, from your impressions of the people that you speak to and other writers and people involved in the arts, do you feel like things are changing? Because for a long time it seemed to be the case that in Russia, so long as you didn't touch politics, you could pretty much you could say what you wanted. You could be very outspoken. Do you think that's changing now?
Well, I mean, it does seem to be pretty miserable, as to be said, in Moscow. I don't know. Admittedly, most of the time of late, I've been in Kiev, and it's very interesting hearing this because in Kiev, if you want, you can go into the old KGB building. There's a little room at the side full of computers. No one else. I mean, there's two very bored archivists who work in there because no one ever goes in there. And you can go in and sit at a terminal and type in anything you want, and there you go. There is the KGB archives. You know, look at it. No one does, but you can if you want. And
I don't think they go up to a very contemporary level.
Well, I mean, it goes up to sort of no. I mean, no.
They stop at a certain point.
The KGB archives rather than the Ukrainian ones. But I mean, it's still, I mean, I've looked through them, and there's more stuff than I could be bothered to look at, and to put it mildly. But what's interesting about what's happening in Ukraine, and even more so in Georgia, is that it's sort of the mirror image of what's happening in Russia. Is there's no real reckoning with the past there either. It's Russia's fault. And I think this is actually part of the problem. In Russia, there is a sort of, they feel very prickly about it because, I mean, Georgians, it's absurd. Both Beria and Stalin were Georgian, and yet if you talk to Georgians, it's genuinely like no Georgian ever did anything wrong. They were occupied by the Russians, and who left in 1991, and everything since then has been grand. And to a certain extent, you hear the same thing in Ukraine, though. I mean, it's a bit more nuanced there. But and I think this part of the problem in Russia is people feel nationalist, bizarrely, about a Georgian, and meanwhile Georgians feel nationalist about him not being. It's very odd, and I think that's part of the problem. I think it's been tied up with a sort of Putin against Saakashvili, Putin against Poroshenko dialogue whereby somehow the Russians ended up on the side of Stalin. I think it's rather unfortunate.
This sort of idea that it behoves you to look at your past squarely in the face seems like a good moment to open up to some questions from the floor. Yes, you sir, over there.
Do we do the speakers
Or, yeah.
Well, I mean, you can hear me, all right?
I can, but everyone else would probably like to hear you as well. Just introduce yourself.
James Thacker, American author. In fact, I was involved with 18 years of the Sikushki in Russia and during the Soviet period with index and censorship. Question of historical memory, which you just referred to, which is what this is about, and I'm a huge admirer of Claude Lanzmann. He spent years and years finding witnesses, hundreds of them, and winnowing it down just to a few, because those were the ones that told the story. This is the first time I've heard historical memory dealt with in this way by relatives. It's very, very powerful. It's extraordinary, really. The only other way than witnesses. And I wonder what the selection process was. We just had a few people here being mentioned, but I mean, there must have been hundreds of people that they could have chosen. And the way you choose them shapes the argument completely. And I was trying to understand how the argument was being shaped by the choice of the relatives.
I would give that question to one of the panel, but actually, can I give it to Noah over there, because he probably can answer your question.
I could probably say a little bit about that. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have the playwrights to answer completely, but obviously I have discussed that with them. So they were very keen to include the testimony of people who were condemned the Stalinist period and were quite liberal in their views, precisely because of the conflict they would therefore have, with their own relatives. They were actually a tendency to forgive their own relatives. And not people who were still pro-Stalinist. There was quite a personal, sometimes personal reasons for the selections. One character is the wife of one of the co-authors, and I think that it was essentially that was the idea, to find those people who there was an inner conflict within them.
Okay, so the writers consciously selected people who had conflicts, who were in conflict with their parents or grandparents' choices, which obviously makes good drama as well, as quite apart from anything else. Thank you. Anyone else got a question? Yes, you over there.
My name is Sigrun Davidsdóttir. I'm an Icelandic journalist. Well, first of all, thank you for this absolutely fascinating performance. To those who were here earlier, but considering that we have two Russians on the stage now, I was just wondering if you had any similar stories in your families, if there was some reflection or echoes of your own stories.
Vladimir.
Yeah, this play is a powerful collection of memories, and my personal story is that I'm probably one of rare people whose family wasn't directly touched by the repressions, so not much was talked about this in my childhood. But then at the age of about, so I knew about the personality cult, cult личности, but what was taught at school, so from the history books, from the Soviet history books. But then when perestroika started, and at the probably 14, 15, I started reading everything that I could get my hands on, the literary magazines, the books that published works of Solzhenitsyn, Shalamov that described this whole period, and of course, I turned anti-Stalinist. But I remember when I was 18 at the university, I remember having discussions with my friends, and I was saying, well, of course, Stalin was bad, but Lenin was a good guy, he had good intentions. So, and only later I realized the full extent of the impact that Soviet rule from its beginning had on Russian society. So it took me years to make sense of history. And in the same way, the Russian society will probably take a lot more than any individual person to make sense of its own history.
What about you, Alexandrina? Have you got
Well,
personal
my grandfather's brother was killed, or was imprisoned and killed during Stalin's time. Well, what I remember, what my parents and my grandparents talked to me, they always between themselves. My feelings from my childhood was that they never had those illusions, and they never, like my mom was telling me then Stalin died. She was a young girl, a little girl, and she remembered that her mother sat like silently in their, not silently, but like just in their family breakfast, that tyrant died.
Right.
So she came to, my mom went to school where everyone was crying, teachers, children, and it was discussed as a big tragedy, and that was on the street. But she knew that among their family friends, they all had a kind of system of signs of exchange, this understanding, okay, it happened finally.
And do you think in that your family was a minority family?
I think all Russian intelligentsia, they more or less were part of the same kind of sharing the same vision and feeling. I think by that time already many people understood that they could not speak openly about that, but this was what my parents told me.
Any more? Yes, you.
Yes, I'm Van der Grace, and I'm a writer and an actress, and I think the complexity of the history of Russia has to be sort of appreciated. This piece has to be put in the context, and I think even the enormity of the Russian Revolution, which you know, we can't really, what we've had in England, and you know, is just what the Russian people have gone through, the enormity of that, and I think we can't underestimate that. And Stalingrad, I mean, the Russian people should be proud. They won the Second World War. I don't think here we've given credit over what they went through. And I think what I do think is really interesting, and I'd like to ask now, we have these oligarchs, or a lot of these ex-KGB people who come here now with their ill-gotten gains, while we have people in Russia who are starving. And we have this situation here where they can't be extradited. There's huge crime going on now. So I think that's another, and it just makes me feel, as was mentioned, that I despair for the Russian people, really, because it just seems like one enormous chapter, and then...
As it happens, Oliver's an expert on this topic.
Yeah, no, don't get me started. I mean, on the note of the Russians winning the Second World War, they defeated Hitler. I'm not sure they won. I think if they won, they would have ended up living better than they'd started. I think that their tragedy is that they lost the Second World War. Their government won. I think the Russians ended up very badly off after the Second World War, in fact almost worse off, which I think is one of the great problems with their coming to terms with the Second World War.
Also that it never was analyzed or discussed.
I mean, with regard to the oligarchs, I completely agree with you. The idea that, I mean, not just Russians, I mean, from all over the world. I mean, the idea that sort of Maxim Bakiev is living in Britain and could try and claim asylum here is absurd. But there you go. I mean, you know, the strength of our country is that we don't send people back without due legal process, and that has its flip side. And if you're very rich, you get to enjoy that flip side. But you know, there you go. I think I'd rather that than the alternative, to be honest. Though I agree, it has.
People are living in starvation. You can understand why they, although it's to support Stalin or want communism back, you can understand why. Although they're two separate things in a way.
No, I completely agree. I can understand why people are very angry about it, and it makes perfect sense. But I don't think that's an argument to abandon due process, with all its flaws in this country, just because they don't have due process in other countries. It's something which I spend a lot of time looking into and tracing the money and trying to find out how it is laundered here and how it's spent here, and the fact that a Ukrainian oligarch who made his entire money from essentially creaming cash off the Ukraine-Russia gas trade managed to buy an ex-tube station for £53.3 million in Knightsbridge is obscene. There's no other way of describing it.
Do you think that, I mean, we spend quite a lot of time in the media in this country and on this stage talking about how rampant the corruption is in Russia, and what a detrimental effect that's having not only on the Russian people but generally on global politics. Do you think in those kinds of examples that you're raising there that we're kind of complicit in that, or at least our governments are, by allowing these people?
Yes, I mean, of course we are. I mean, there's no question about it. I'm not sure to what extent we're knowingly complicit. I think there's a lot of sort of turning a blind eye and saying, oh well, you know.
That's the international ruling class, isn't it?
I agree. Yes.
To each other.
Yes, I agree.
Yes, you sir over there.
Hello, my name's John Morrison. I worked in Russia for many years in the Brezhnev period as a journalist, and I also wrote a biography of Boris Yeltsin, and I've written a couple of plays featuring Russian history. I think the good thing about this play, which most of the people quoted were from a very elite group. You've got all these mentions of the house on the embankment, which was the big, and still, the big government house on the Moscow River where all top officials and their families lived. So in a way, it's an untypical cross-section, but I think the moral dilemmas for these families were pretty much the same as for large swathes of the population, and whoever it was said you don't point fingers is absolutely right, because unlike in Nazi Germany, where there was a fairly clear historical dividing line, but you could draw between the perpetrators and the victims, in Russia, with 70 years of Soviet history, the victims and the perpetrators have been they're the same people. And so it's very hard to point fingers at who is guilty. And so you get this complex of collective, not so much collective guilt as collective innocence, where it's just very, very difficult to get to grips with. I would say that having lived a little bit through the period of perestroika and what came after, there was this period where there was a short-lived attempt to get to grips with Russian history and Soviet history and find out the truth, a sort of, in German they call it overcoming the past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. It didn't work, and people moved on. It was all too difficult, and I think the moment has passed. I think it's too late now for because everybody's died, for Russia to really get to grips with this period of history.
I'd like to ask the two Russians on the panel whether they agree that the moment's passed for that.
Well, one of the inspirations for me when I got involved in politics was this idea of trying to bring closer the time when the government will serve its purpose of sort of nudging the people towards making sense of its history and moving towards, you know, the European values of democracy and freedom. And I think that I'm quite confident that this time will come, and it probably will come sooner than many people think. And
but specifically on looking at the past, Alexandrina, do you think the moment's passed? Excuse the pun.
I think it's never too late, and I think the contemporary current and tragedy of Russia is that it never happened. Maybe I agree with you that those attempts were made. They never was good enough, and they just stopped doing that. And
it seemed to be the implication of what you were saying was that the attempts came too late, that it was already too mixed up.
No, but I think there is no question that some people are already dead. It's even to explain to our children, to people of my generation, to learn those lessons of history, to make the right accents, even for memory of almost every family in Stalin's time lost someone, or some families were killed, but there was no, I think all people whom I know, they lost either one grandmother or grandfather in the camps, or so this is for memory of these people who were killed by Stalin's regime. There should be the right memorial, the right kind of service and discussion, analysis of this situation for future and for sake of the future generations.
There is an organisation set up that was dedicated to doing that is now in some trouble.
We've got a comment. We have Elena Gremina tonight with us, who is the artistic director of Teatr Dok, one of the most persecuted theatres in Russia, and she's come for these 4 days for the series to be present here. She spoke on the panel on Tuesday, but listening to what we've been discussing, she'd like to say a few words, and I'll probably have to translate.
Тема коллективной вины и коллективного искупления очень меня волнует, потому что это имеет прямое отношение к тому общественному расколу, который сейчас существует в России и который все усугубляется и усугубляется.
So I have a great personal interest in the theme of collective guilt and collective innocence, because I believe that this contributes to the sort of the separation, the crack in the society in Russia.
И тут действительно вот девушка, которая выступала, она упомянула Октябрьскую революцию, но, может быть, это все началось не в 30-е годы, когда мы уже видали вот эти плоды. Все это началось гораздо раньше, может быть, если так говорить генеалогию, это еще, так сказать, с как бы отмены крепостного права в России, которая только в XIX веке в конце произошла, и общественной борьбы вокруг этого, и первых революционных вот этих выступлений.
As the lady here in the second row mentioned, the revolution in the early 20th century, but most likely this whole kind of revolution protest movement has started not in the 30s, but much earlier, probably when the serfdom was
abolished.
Emancipation, thank you. Yes, so kind of late 19th century. That's probably when the protest has really begun.
Я бы не стала сравнивать вот это с ситуацией в Германии, где все достаточно было просто. Скорее, это похоже на французскую революцию XVIII века, когда вчерашние судьи и вчерашние жертвы встречались потом у гильотины.
So I wouldn't compare the situation in Russia with what happened in Germany. Rather, I would, if there is any parallel, I would draw it with France and the revolution there in the 18th century, when both the perpetrators and the innocent people have all kind of met at the guillotine.
Террор, сталинский террор, как раз сегодня человек осуждал кого-то, завтра он сам становился жертвой этого террора. Поэтому вот эта вот история, что сегодня ты палач, завтра ты жертва, на природе сталинского террора как раз очень хорошо можно изучать.
So again, during the Stalin era, the terror was that today you might denounce somebody, or you might write, you know, what are they called? The play mentions snitching somebody, but the day after somebody else can turn on you. So one day, so the sort of situation when it's difficult to differentiate who's the innocent, who's the guilty, and that's where really the problem lies.
Мы к 17-му году, к столетию революции, мы делаем большой проект в театре документальный. Мы исследуем родословные людей, потому что каждый русский человек, если он расскажет просто историю своих прадедушек и прабабушек, это просто история практически врагов, потому что у каждого есть в роду те, кто друг друга просто убил, если бы встретился.
So to commemorate the centenary of the 1917 revolution, we are in Teatr Dok, we are creating a project which is going to be based on families. Какие-то особенности или просто все семьи? So we just we are taking random people, all sorts of people, and we look at their lineage, we'll look at their grandparents and great-grandparents, and we can see that these stories, this project is going to be basically the story of the enemies, because in all the families there would be people who would turn against each other.
Последняя какая-то история, например, про человека, которым я стал работать там просто в театре, потом выясняется, что родословная у него такая. Он родился, это человек где-то ему лет, наверное, 60 с лишним сейчас, но он родился в концлагере. Мама его была еврейка, политическая заключенная, а папа его был замначальника колонии, который на этом потом потерял свой пост, вот на этой связью. И как бы это, в общем-то, человек, в общем, он рассказывал, что до сих пор, там, папа уже был пенсионер, но ему в глаза все боялись смотреть.
So basically, one of the stories, this person is now 60 years old, but he had his mother, he was born in the camps, and his mother, я не запомню, his mother was a Jewish lady. So she was a political prisoner. She was Jewish, and it's Article 58. I don't think it'll help anybody, but she was a Jewish lady in the camps, political prisoner, and right. And his father was one of the deputy directors of that camp. So right. So when this character this real person was born, the 60-year-old who's now, when he was born, his father lost his position in the camp. Right, but until the very last moment of his career, until the father, who was the deputy director of the camp, and until his very last day at work, until he went and became a pensioner, people were frightened to look into his eyes.
Да, последний. Поэтому вопрос вот искупления, кто про этого человека, кто вот в его случае перед кем он кому должен каяться, если сама его жизнь это результат вот этого всего чудовищного смешения жертв и палачей.
So in this instance, for example, it's a very good example to demonstrate that it's so hard. Like, who is this person supposed to see as the enemy? And it just shows the history of this mix of the perpetrators and of the innocent people.
You basically just put your finger on how incredibly complex and nuanced this whole situation is. And at the risk of dragging this thing out a little bit, I would like to ask you a follow-up question. Sophia, for you've painted this incredibly nuanced picture, but for those of us who either like or need to see things in black and white, can you please just tell us, you made some historical analogies, but can you please just tell us, is it back in the USSR or not?
Конечно, нет, потому что нынешнее государство в чем-то, может быть, она гораздо опаснее и гораздо, и, так сказать, еще более антинародная, чем был Советский Союз.
Of course not, because the current government that we have is much more dangerous and in a sense is much more anti-people, anti-state than even the Soviet government.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was Yelena Gremina. Thank you. And also to my fellow panelists, Vladimir Ashurkov, Alexandrina Markova, Oliver Bullough, and John Friedman. Thank you all. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.